Hello, everybody, and welcome to Edie's latest webinar, this time on implementing a credible carbon strategy for your business. I'm Joshua Neal, I'm the intelligence editor here at Edie, and I'll be chairing the session today, which will look at integrating carbon credits into your strategy, building credibility through clear communication and governance, and evaluating carbon projects based on integrity, fit-for-purpose outcomes, and long-term value. We have about 45 minutes today to explore the topic, and that will comprise around 30 minutes of presentation with our expert today, and then a 15-minute Q&A where you can have your questions answered. As always, I'd like to get through as many of your questions as possible during that segment, so as soon as you have any questions to ask Thomas, or anything that you'd like to mention in regard to what's been said, please do write it in the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of the screen. You can also upvote popular questions so that we can prioritize what to ask when we start that section. The event is also being recorded, so that'll be sent both by email to you after the webinar's finished and is available on our site if you want to watch it again. I won't jump into context this time because I'm sure a lot of you know the situation and are aware of the topic. So what I will do is immediately introduce our speaker today, Thomas Stocker, who's Vice President of Environmental Products at Anew Climate, to talk us through this topic. Thomas, if you'd like to come on screen and begin.
Hello, everybody. So, sure, let me set it up. Okay. I hope everybody can see it perfectly. If not, Josh, please let me know. So today we're going to speak about how to implement a credible carbon credit strategy in your business. My name is Thomas Stocker. I'm Vice President of Environmental Products here at Anew Climate. So I'll start by... Let me pass there. Okay, 1 minute on Anew. So we're leading environmental commodity company that came out of the US. So we're a merger of two companies, Element Markets and Blue Source, that have been working in the US for the past 20 years. And then TPG Rise came over. That's the largest climate impact fund in the world, run by Bono and Jeff Skoll. They bought the two companies and merged them. Then we bought another company out of Canada, another out of Germany, and we kept expanding. So we have two main sides of the business. The low carbon fuel side, mainly biomethane. So we have 20% of the US, Canadian, and German biomethane market. Then 1 giga of renewable energy under management in the US, and 400 carbon projects that we have developed over the past 20 plus years. So more on the carbon side, because it's what we're going to talk about today. We have developed, I think, over 30 different types of projects. So ARR, IFM, regenerative agriculture, peatland restoration, landfill, bio-CCS, ODS destruction, HFC reclaim, biochar, so on and so forth. This is to say that we have done all sorts of projects, so we're not a one product shop and we're not biased towards one type of projects. Every project type has its benefits, and we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between one of them, the pros and cons of each of them, and why like a balanced portfolio is relative. So we're pretty big in improved forest management, likely the largest in the world. So we manage 2.5 million hectares of land in the US for that. And we own 700,000 ourselves through Aurora Sustainable Lands. That's a sister company. So we're the 7th largest landowner in the US. And we came over to Europe several years ago to do the same thing. So we're developing projects over here in ARR, in IFM, in bio-CCS, and peatland restoration. And we're doing all sorts of things from the project development. Sometimes we're investors. So if you want to think of Anew, you can think about us as a risk investor, a project developer, and a marketer of carbon credits. So I'll start with the super basics on purpose just to get everybody online. And also sometimes it's nice to see the fundamentals and remember why. So one carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 that has been reduced, avoided, or removed from the atmosphere. And I'll go into the project types later and I explain how each one of them does that. It has to be real, so it has to be in accordance to the latest scientific methodologies. It has to be additional. Additionality is super important. Additionality means that it goes beyond business as usual. So if it's legally forced, that's not a carbon project. You have to do something that wouldn't happen in the absence of the carbon project. It has to be verifiable by a third-party entity that can be a Bureau Veritas verifying the process. And I'll go into a lot more detail on how that has evolved recently. It has to be enforceable. So like you have to prove that there's ownership of that carbon credit and there's no double counting. And it has to be permanent. And permanence also has a lot of like sideways and questions around it and like tech permanence and nature permanence, but at least you have to have a solid buffer pools and an explanation on the reversals in case you're talking about nature-based. So there are multiple projects, like, I don't know, 100 project types, but we can divide them most in like 4 buckets: tech reductions, nature conservation, nature removal, and tech removals. Each of them have benefits, each of them have some issues regarding them, and we'll talk about like the basics. So in tech reductions, like 2 typical projects are landfill gas, in which you destroy methane basically by creating renewable energy from a waste residue from biomass. You can change methane, which is basically CH4, into CO2 when you burn it. And when you burn it, the greenhouse gas potential of methane, which is around 27, you're doing a permanent reduction from 27 to 1, which is great. Then you have like ODS destruction. Like these gases can go up to 400 times CO2. So these projects are great in the sense they're 100% permanent. Once you did that destruction, there's no reversal. It doesn't exist. The monitoring is pretty simple just because you have a machine and you can show it. And the cost of abatement is relatively low. So these are very low-hanging fruit to get projects across the line. That's why if you are aware of ICBCM and CCPs, all of these projects were the ones that got CCP eligibility pretty fast. Then we move on into nature conservation. 2 examples of nature conservations are improved forest management conservation and RED, which is a little bit more well-known, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So if you think about like, okay, we have a climate problem, let's start doing something. What do? We start by conserving what we have, and that's the concept of RED. So it has a lot of co-benefits to conserve a native forest, like a native forest in Congo, a native forest in Indonesia, a native forest in the Amazon. But the problem with these projects has always been the counterfactual. What would have happened in the absence of the projects? So there were like deforestation rates saying like, okay, I would have deforested 5% per year according what everybody else was doing. And when like people went down and did like rigorous analysis of what would have happened in the absence, they realized there was some overcrediting. In some projects, a lot of overcrediting. So what recently has been done in what I like to call the carbon markets 2.0. The 1.0 was like before the 2020-21 issues, and since then a lot of evolution comes along, is with dynamic baselines. So dynamic baselines are ex post analysis of what really happened, not what I said would have happened with what happened, what really happened in the area around me versus myself. And that's great because we're stopping with the this is what I would have done, and I can show this is what happened versus what I did. And that's great both in RED and in improved forest management on the conservation portion of what would have been harvested in the absence in a forest management. So then we go, okay, we have tech reductions, nature conservation, we go into the removal sector, which is everybody's hype on removals, and it's great. We need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we start with like nature removals. There we have like IFM removals. We basically extend rotation on a managed forest. We have regen ag removals. So in like soil carbon, you can do cover cropping or you can do activities like no-till that increases carbon in the soil. And you have the typical one that is afforestation, reforestation. You plant a seed, you plant a tree, and it grows. It has a lot of co-benefits, of course, such as the nature conservation. It just takes a bit longer because you don't have a working forest. You have a forest that you're creating. The additionality is more clear. You have like a bare piece of land and I'm planting a tree, so there's no additionality discussion. And it's right now the most cost-effective way to remove carbon off the atmosphere. When you go into the tech removal sector, yeah, you go into more like durable, as they like to call it. They store carbon for more time. And here we start with like biochar projects that is like 100-year plus, more or less, according to the protocols. BECS or bio-CCS, depending on how we want to call it. And then we go into the 1,000-year potentials. And like bio-CCS is basically, for example, burning wood residues for renewable energy and releasing CO2 and storing it permanently underground. And then you have the DAX projects. And the DAX projects, you're capturing CO2 out of the air and storing it underground. These projects are great. The only problem right now is that they're very expensive. So we're hoping that as technology evolves, the cost of abatement becomes lower, which is great. The permanence is high, the additionality is clear, and they have high future growth potential. The only time I like, and this personal opinion in this whole like nature versus tech, and when people say like nature is not permanent, tech is super permanent, I'm like, well, let's put a little blur on that. So I can point you to a 5,000-year-old tree that is in Chile and it's still there. Can you point me to a man-made site storing CO2 1,000 years ago? You can't. You can say that I can show you two storage sites that have CO2 in there for 1,000 years. And with this, I don't want to say that I'm against tech. I love tech and we need everything. I'm just saying like everything has cons and pros, and we need to like look at them, see the benefits, see what they're doing, see how they grow, and we need them all. And we need them all together now because we're complicated with the whole climate. So, validation. If you look at a project in like the carbon markets 1.0, we have three steps. The first three steps. So basically, you were going to select a standard and methodology, say like you're going to select gold standards methodology on biological fermentation and carbon capture and storage. Okay, you start as a project developer, you select that standard, you do a project, and then you do the entire project, and you get like Bureau Veritas, TÜV Nord, or whoever validating your project, and then that goes back to the standard, and the standard says, yes, all of this makes sense, it's correct, and you issue the credits, sell the credits, so on and so forth. That's what it used to be. And like in the past, like 1-2 years, two new steps came in, which is great to provide more robustness into the system. The first is ICBCM, the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market. So what do? Is they go and analyze the different methodologies and say like, this methodology has clarity on additionality, on permanence. It's conservative enough. I like it. And if they like it after their analysis, which has a very senior group of people doing it, it gets a CCP label. Important. The methodology gets a CCP label. What does that mean? You can have like a project doing using a methodology that is super good and it passes all of the first three stages, but there still might be a problem. That's where rating agencies come in. So rating agencies come in to check all of the other things, just saying, okay, did you select the right methodology? Did you implement it properly? Did the verifier do their work? Did the standard do the work? Did you implement the methodology that had CCPs according to everything that's done? Okay, rating, boom. And that goes from AAA to D depending on the rating agency, and I'm going to talk a little bit further along about that. But here's just to say that the market has been evolving with more checks and balances. Now we go into like, okay, jurisdictional risk versus co-benefit. So we're looking at projects and it's like, okay, should I pick a project out of Europe, out of the US, out of Canada? Should I pick a project out of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia? And let's compare. Climate mitigation, whatever project, same. I plant a tree, it captures CO2, that's the same scenario. Climate adaptation, it's great if you plant a tree in Spain, it's going to help a little bit with climate adaptation, but if you do it in Africa or in Southeast Asia, it helps much more. Like climate adaptation money is way more necessary. Biodiversity co-benefits. If we're saying nature, it's more or less the same unless you go into hotspots. But you can even have hotspots in Europe, like in Romania, it's super biodiverse. Then co-benefits. If your co-benefits is the key for you, you really need to go into the global south. You cannot compare a project in Europe, US, Japan versus, I don't know, whichever in Bolivia, Congo, or whichever other country. Then you start coming with the issues. Okay, then you go into political risk. Okay, if you go into the global south, there is a higher risk of change in law, like Indonesia changing its laws on climate. There's a higher risk of like human rights abuses that happened in a couple of projects. You won't have that in Europe. Everybody's going to go to jail for decades if anything like that happened that happened in that part, and you have the currency risk. So you need to balance this around. So, and by the way, I'm Argentinian. We invented half of those political, social, and currency risk. What we tend to recommend as a way to adapt here is like, look at your global footprint. Where do you have assets? So let's say you have assets in Europe, you have assets in Colombia, Argentina, South Africa, and I don't know, Indonesia. Okay, if you're comfortable operating already in those countries and you have business in those countries, then you know the political risk, the social risk, and the currency risk. Try and match your footprint with emissions. Here, where my emissions, try to find the same projects over there. And that has a lot of benefits beyond like it's beyond reducing the risk. There's also the accounting issues there. So my emissions are in this ledger, my credits are in this ledger. Nobody's going to come to you and say like, well, you should have taken corresponding adjustments. Even if I don't think so, some people think so. But if you're in the same ledger, no corresponding adjustments are even possible within the same jurisdiction. It just doesn't make sense. So that's a way to manage like where do I buy my credits and what's the benefit. But if you're buying in a country in the global south and you don't have operations, it's just harder. I'm not saying don't do it. It's just like make sure that you're doing the political, social, and currency risk analysis to see what you're exposed to. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about like a policy. And to start with the policy side, I'm going to go with something super basic that when you look at the carbon market, it's not one carbon market. Like the first division, because I can divide it in 100 places, it's like voluntary carbon market and compliance. Voluntary is companies doing commitments about how to use carbon credits in their decarbonization strategy. They can pick whatever project they want at whatever price they want. And then you need to start to align with different criteria to make sure that you're saying the right thing and following the right guideline. And I'm going to show you different guidelines and different things you could say. And then you have another market that are compliance markets, which basically, for example, in California, you have a cap and trade that you can use carbon credits up to a percentage. You have the same thing in Colombia. You have the same thing in South Africa. You have the same thing in Singapore. You had it in Europe up to 2020 in the EU ETS. And now there is a consideration on whether carbon credits are going to go back in or not from 2030 onwards. So that's the difference, compliance and voluntary. So when we look at the targets in Europe and how we're doing, and here we're going to talk first about like continental Europe, EU 27 basically, and I'm going to talk separately about the UK later. So Europe said that it had to hit a 55% emission reductions by 2030. Currently, as of 2024, it was in 37%, so we're not on target, basically. And then it has a separate land-based removals target of 310 million tons. And by 2024, we are in 212. So we're not on target either on the amount of like carbon that needs to be stored in the atmosphere. So we really need to push every lever on the toolbox we have for decarbonization, and like generating credits in Europe would be great, as well as generating credits anywhere else and building demand for the carbon market, which in the end helps us fight climate change. So there's a couple of things that happen in Europe to generate that demand. In 2024, Europe came in with a carbon removals, carbon farming framework, which is basically setting up different methodologies for quantification of projects in Europe. So these are European projects, and it's like we're looking into peatland restoration, ARR, so on and so forth. But basically setting the minimum threshold on what the EU Commission believes a project should have to be considered additional and a good project. And that has been going on for a while. Methodologies are advancing. By the end of the year, we're going to have like proper methodologies to start to implement. And the standards are figuring out how to adapt those methodologies. And there's going to be a union registry in 2028. These are the methodologies that are currently underway. Likely there's going to be more afterwards. So we have afforestation, regenerative agriculture, peatland restoration in the nature-based sector. I know that improved forest management is coming after. Then there's carbon storage and building. And on the tech-based sector, we have bio-CCS, DAX, and biochar. As I just mentioned, these methodologies like standards like Gold Standard or Vera are trying to figure out how to adapt the methodologies through their new methodologies to be CRCF eligible. And at the same time, Europe is trying to build its own like standard and registry that's supposed to come up in 2028. So it's not 100% clear how all of this will interact. Will Europe just end up being like a stamp, like giving a CRCF stamp, like the ICVCM gets its CCPs, or are we going to end up with a full EU registry and validators and verifiers and a whole system in Europe? This is all being decided in this next couple of years. But what we do know is like Europe is building let's call it a framework to develop projects within Europe to promote European-based projects. At the same time, it's promoting demand internationally. So the 2040 target came in with 90% reduction. And what came in there is that from 2035 onwards, there can be 5% use of Article 6 credits. So Article 6 credits come like mostly evolved from the global south. So there are credits created over there, and their PACMAN, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, that are generating projects in the global south. And they have all of these rigorous methodologies that have been working on the past years. So basically what a country needs to do, you as a project developer do a project, you request a country like, can you let me basically export this and take it out from your ledger and import it into Europe, and Europe counts it. So what's happening there is Europe will be able to import Article 6 credits up to 5% to meet their targets. There's some discussions if they're going to bring it up sooner, but no decision has been done yet. And exactly the how they're going to purchase, is it going to be, are they going to transpose it to like countries, and each country is going to do it by themselves? Is that you going to group it together? We don't know, but like what we know is carbon credits are in Europe's system through Article 6, through CRCF, and the implementation is all being developed. There's also a potential role in the effort sharing regulation outside of the ETS. So the first discussion is going to be in July about whether to integrate carbon credits into the ETS. It's likely that like tech-based removals come in. Due to the cost of tech-based removals, at the short term, I don't see the benefit of a credit of 200 euros with an allowance price at 80 of having any benefit unless you subsidize it. And if you subsidize it, who's going to pay it for it? Taxpayers, while the industry is already having a hard time. So I hope nature-based comes in as well at the beginning as a cost containment without losing your climate target, because in the end, allowance is a piece of paper, right? It's a piece of paper with a fine. It doesn't have anything behind it, just funds that flow to different areas. So that's more or less what like we hope is happening, and that would push demand for European-based projects, while at the same time the Europe group label is going to push demand for international projects. And then you have the effort sharing regulation, that is everything that's outside of the UETS and other sectors that are figuring out what to do as well. And the UK now. So the UK has a 28% carbon reduction goal by 2035. At the present, no Article 6 credits are allowed, but they did make a significant change recently with GGRs, as they're called in the UK's greenhouse gas removals, for the integration into the UK ETS by 2029. Here, like, I'm glad they're integrated, but I have the same issue. It's like, if the price of these credits is above, then you either have to do a contract for difference and taxpayers pay for it, or basically you have to include nature, like the woodland code or something like that. I'm supportive of nature with insurance. Important. You need insurance to create an extra level of permanence beyond buffer pools. And okay, those are the regulations, high level, like UK, Europe. Then we start to talk about you're a company. So what can I do? What can I say? In the UK, the Oxford principles are very interesting. These are very high level guidelines. They don't tell you exactly what you need to do, but the guidelines are very useful. First, it's like, first reduce. And like whoever tells you otherwise is like greenwashing 100%. You need to hit your reduction targets, and you need to do your best to reduce emissions. But sometimes the cost of abatement of your next reduction becomes so high that it's difficult to stay on business and keep on the reduction targets. When that starts to happen is when carbon credits start to make sense. So personally, I think carbon credits would be cheaper than your internal cost of abatement, because if not, please reduce and keep reducing. So the core principles over here are just like deep emission cuts and like use avoidance, but transition into removals over term, and then transition into durable removals over term. And then we have like SBTI as another framework. There's thousands of companies in here that have been signed into SBTI that has like science-based targets reductions. And for a long time, carbon credits weren't allowed in here. And the big shift happened recently on what they call ongoing emissions responsibilities. So, and we're going to see it a little bit better graph later, but you as a company, you're reducing like this your emissions, but you're still emitting all of this. This is massive. This is massive amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. So if you have the capacity, if your business is doing well, and you can use carbon credits to offset portions of what you weren't able to reduce because the cost of abatement were so high, great. Please do something. So what they're saying is that whatever you cannot reduce, you can offset from 10%, 50, 100, whatever you can do. And they also are putting some guidelines on like up to 2035, you can use both reductions and removals from 2035 onwards, only removals. All of this is in the making. They're supposed to come out with the final information May or June, last I heard. Hope I'm not wrong, but that's the last information I got. And it's super interesting. So I'm going to focus a little bit of like the whole idea on like, because we were talking about credible carbon credit strategy, right? So we talked about the projects, we talked about the risks, we talked about the different frameworks. So what's a quality project, right? So I like ICBCM and what they're doing. And here I'm going to go a little bit in more detail. The Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market created like a board of directors, a very experienced carbon people to analyze which carbon credit methodologies were really additional or not. And like throughout the process, for example, renewable energy is out. Like renewable energy has been going on for a long time, so it's really not additional anymore, except for like rooftop or very off-grid. But if you do a project in most countries, it already has a decent IRR by itself, internal rate of return. So it's not additional anymore. So they stamp the project with CCPs, and now the universe of projects that was like this of carbon credits suddenly becomes smaller into what is considered quality. That doesn't mean every project in here that has CCPs is good enough. You still need to do another layer of due diligence, either by yourself, a trusted entity, or ratings. So ratings come in from like you have the universe of projects to a lower universe of projects, and now you have the rating of projects. Remember when I presented the 5 stages. So rating agencies come in, the most well-known at B0 and Silvera, and analyze whether that specific project is doing everything it says to be done and establish a rating from like AAA to D. And the client request tends to be to BB or BBB plus. That is kind of the criteria. It's like this is a solid project. This solid is good enough. It has enough like additionality. It has enough permanence. It's showing the right thing. So that's kind of a way to like decide which project within all of the set of projects. Go for the CCP. Go for the rating. And then like the next step would say like, okay, now I more or less understand the scenario and I want to build a portfolio. The first question I have is like, okay, I'm seeing pricing all over the place. What's the drivers on pricing? So there's a lot of drivers on pricing. First is the project type, and this has to do with like, what does it cost to really do the project? So there's very different costs in like reductions versus removals. There's very different costs versus like planting a tree to building a pull DAC facility that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and like storing it underground. So that already has like a cost that gets transmitted into price. Then you have like the quality and integrity. So additionality, permanence, CCP eligibility, co-benefits, ratings, all of this moves the amount of projects smaller and smaller and smaller. And when you have a smaller amount of projects, demand starts to outpace supply, as in any market in the world where demand outpaces supply, prices go up. Location, similar. You have a demand supply imbalance premiums. For example, we have projects out of New York, and like New York companies want New York projects, and there's more companies in New York than projects in New York, so projects in New York are priced higher than in other places. I think we're going to see the same thing here in Europe as we're developing projects in Sweden and in Lithuania, in Netherlands, in Spain, and like companies within those countries or that have footprint in those countries would like prefer projects in those countries. And of course, compliance. If it's compliance, it's compliance, then it's because of allocation. Then we have the whole vintage scenario. Like best practices recently are like use up to a 5-year vintage. Then some players are saying up to 3 years. And then you have some players that saying like, but carbon credits expire. No, they don't. They don't expire. So wouldn't it be better if I just like support a project that has been going along for such a long time? And I'm like, maybe if you believe that, and I have companies that is like, I want the 2010 credit. Fine. I'm just saying that's not what the industry tends to do. They tend to look at 5 years, but everybody in the voluntary carbon market can decide what they think is correct and why. I just recommend you really explain the whys. Volume, such as in anything, larger volume, lower price. If I buy 10,000 shoes, it's going to be cheaper than if I buy one shoe. And then the delivery risk and timing. If I have the shoe made and ready to sell at the store, it's going to be more expensive than if I tell you, please give me a shoe. When are you going to have it? Like in a year. Okay, maybe you'll have it that they don't know. And those are forwards. And forwards tend to be cheaper than spots. So now we're coming in together and like we're bringing some of the things that we already discussed and putting it all in before going into portfolio. Okay, governance and internal guardrails. Set clear internal rules. When, which, and how. How will you buy carbon credits? Which ones? And just make sure you're setting a criteria that you're comfortable with and you follow it. Select the initiatives you like. SBTI, Oxford Principles, whichever you want. Like select it and make sure you're aligning properly what you can say or what you can't say within those initiatives. And establish clear processes. Clear processes on like saying, this is the initiative, these are the carbon credits, and before purchasing, I have a committee of 3 people that are going to revise if we're looking at this, and it's not just one person in procurement saying, yeah, I like the project, or a click, and then you present it somewhere and you appear somewhere with some criticism. Then the decision on spot, short forward or off takes. Like before the market moved a lot into spot, we are increasingly having like offtake demand on like 2030, 2040 delivery of 100,000 credits per year for 10 years. Can you do that? Yeah, we can do it. We can adjust it. So the procurement structures varies and you need to decide how you want to manage those typical risk levels. Claims, and this is aligned to ones, but I won't say it again. Be specific. Say exactly what you reduced and what you're offsetting. And if you don't want to say offsetting because you don't like that word and you want to say contribution, say contribution. Make those decisions, but just back it up. Back it up, basically. Have the data. Avoid blanket claims. That's very important. And then when you're saying language, first regulations. Like check which regulation, which law you have to follow. Like CSRD has some laws on how to explain how carbon credits are being used, and you have to say A, B, C, D. Say it that way. And then align with the initiatives that are voluntary. And it's like, okay, the CSRD, I'm making sure I'm following this because this is law. And the other is like an initiative I signed on to that tells me to say another thing. And managing risk and reputation. So portfolio diversification, I'm going to present that in 2 seconds on why a diversified portfolio is more useful for a company to reduce risk and expose itself to a wider set of projects, and a DD on the developer. You need to make sure that whichever developer you're picking has a technical skill set for the particular projects that you're doing. And I recommend a deep financial KYC, especially if you're doing a long-term offtake. So if you're doing a long-term offtake for a company for 2030, 2040, does that company have solid financials to show that they're going to be there in 2040 delivering those credits or not? So for offtakes, it's super important, especially if you're doing any sort of prepayment. This may sound by common sense, but like it's really important to have them, all of those guardrails. So what's an ideal portfolio? I'm going to give just this is what an ideal portfolio could look like. For me, an ideal portfolio is diversified. It evolves through projects over time from lower hanging fruit to more complex projects. And I have a diverse set of projects. The more projects I have, the delivery risk gets reduced. So here's an example. So first, the black line going down is your reduction. So first, reduce. Always go for the reduction. Now, in this assumption, everything below it is your ongoing emissions responsibility. And here we're representing that you're offsetting 100% of those. So what are we doing? First, you can see that like as your reduction goes down, your cost of abatement goes up. So the next ton you need to reduce is probably more expensive because you need a newer technology, something extra that's more expensive than before. Typical, okay, changing my bulbs to LED, that's really cheap. Changing my gas to biomethane, okay, that's more expensive. Or changing from biomethane to green hydrogen, well, that's really expensive. So you move along the curve while you're doing your different reductions, and the carbon credits should support that. So we tend to recommend make sure that your portfolio, not per project, your portfolio makes it below the reduction, because if not, reduce. So here's an example, 2026, 2030. Okay, let's do a combination of tech reductions that are permanent, clearly additional, with nature conservation. Let's start by conserving what we have and put some nature-based removals in there. So we go to a second period. In a second period, okay, so maybe tech reductions are already more business as usual. So I start to pull back from some of them and I start to include more nature-based removals. And another layer, and you do that again, and now you start including tech-based removals that are more expensive, that we need them, especially in the long term. And you move along the line until you reach a point where you're just in removals and you have a combination of nature and tech. This is just an example, and that's an example pricing of the combination of those different technologies so that you can compare with your internal cost of abatement. And you can play around with this a lot, but it's a nice scenario to have to think about like, okay, I need to reduce first, but I want to do something. What's the cost of that? How can I diversify? And what are the benefits of each project? And that's it. I really appreciate your time. Now, I think we're good. We can go into questions. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for that fantastic presentation. It's got some emotes there and applause. A good sign, I think. We've already got quite a few questions lined up. I had a few of my own, but we'll start with the audience ones and try and get through as many as we can here. One here, I know that you already spoke about this a little bit, but I think maybe we can just touch on it a little bit more, which is what are your thoughts on focusing too much on carbon credits as opposed to, specific in-house emission reductions? Do you have any kind of
Yeah,
further
reduce
thoughts?
first.
Yeah.
If you have the possibility to reduce. Now the thing is that is your next reduction, what's the cost of your next reduction? And try to figure out if that cost of your next reduction starts to become too expensive in order to make more sense to say like, okay, maybe if I'm doing one reduction and I really could purchase 4 credits, when does it start to make sense for you? And I cannot give you like a clear, like when it's 5, you should pull the trigger. I really can't. But what I really need to say is like, you need to think internally and make the decision what makes sense to your company, but reduce first 100%. Like we need to reduce, but it's like reduction right now regretfully is not enough and we're way off path to hitting like a reasonable target. Last time I heard we were like going into 3.54 degrees. So that like where's the 1.5? Yep.
Okay, fantastic. I just got rid of my questions. There we go. We've got one here which has been upvoted as well. For a UK business with unavoidable emissions, the Woodland Carbon Code is relatively new, with few current verified units, but millions which will evolve over time. If a UK business wants to mitigate its emissions with a UK carbon scheme, should they be investing now to ensure carbon units for the future and to secure the price now? What advice would you give to UK businesses in this position?
So here's tricky. So we analyze the Woodland Code. I'm personally not a fan, and it's not because of the methodology itself. I'm not a fan of ex ante deliveries. So personally, I prefer standards like, for example, the gold standard AR methodology that you don't get delivered anything before, and the developer needs to wait out and deliver the credits when they are really like, I think they called it, I don't remember the name, but like they come from PIUs to something else so that they like kind of blossom or something like that. I would buy ex post. That would be the case. But it is a good time to lock in future supply of high quality credits because it's going to be a constraint in the next 5 years. It's happening. I hope I answered as best as possible, but it wasn't an easy question there.
Okay, we have another here. Do you think companies might invest in other companies' projects in order to benefit or buy into the carbon credit aspect? Surely there are benefits they're saying to the project from this like investment view. What are your thoughts on that, Irene?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly. It says invest directly into the project instead of buying the carbon credits. Do you read it like that, Josh?
So I think they're saying sort of investing in another company's projects.
I'm going to take it as invest in the project instead of buying the credits because
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm getting super, but like I think that's great. You just need to assume the risks. So going into the project firsthand, you can request a lot of things from that developer. Like I wanted like with A, B, C, and whatever tagging and whatever else. But you come into the whole risks, right? So a project developer assumes a lot of the risks of like, what if the credits deliver half? What if there's a change in law? What if there's a change in currency? So this is the difference between like buying a shoe and like investing in building the shoe factory. So it's like it's a decision on where do you want to be in that business. You want to be a person that uses shoes or you want to be a person that produces shoes. So, and there's no correct answer. We work with companies in both cases. A company needs to decide what level of risk they want to take. So if you are buying the shoe that's already saying your risk is zero, you have the price, you have it there. The further you go up, like, and the first is a short forward coming, then it's an offtake. Here is project investment. The risk is higher and higher as you go up. So, but you can accommodate it more. So that's again very personal, and we do both. But like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one just in. Uh, it's talking about they work in climate comms and carbon markets, the hardest mitigation tool to communicate around and to get the public interested in. And there are a number of reasons for that. But what would your advice be on starting to communicate around carbon markets on solid ground? I think this is
No,
something
no,
that's been
yeah, no,
tackled.
it's super complex, and I more or less get it laid around it. But first, it's like if you want to start on a level, it's okay. Where's your company headquartered? Okay, my headquarter is in X jurisdiction. What does the law of that jurisdiction state? That you need to say ABC, or it says nothing. Okay, it says nothing. You can go 100% to decide. I like SBTI, I like Oxford's principles, I like whatever, and I go down that route. Make sure that you're doing it properly because stakeholders will still come after you if they think you're not doing it properly, even if there is no government regulation. But if there is government regulation, always start with a government regulation because if not, you're going into a lawsuit. So you need to make your own decisions. Good things is that there are guidelines right now, but it is complex. I was a fan of the Green Claims Directive. If done properly, the Green Claims Directive in Europe could have been perfect because they could tell you exactly what you could say. But if done improperly, it could kill every single claim. And in the end, beyond carbon credits, like it's good that you're able to tell your customers the good things you're doing for the climate and that helps your customer pick your product versus somebody that is not doing that, and the customer can decide whether that environmental benefit is valued as a even same price, I pick this one, or even different price, I pay more for this. Because in the end, we're trying to promote that more people pick the sustainable product. So if you're unable to communicate it and you're ever to share about it, it's a problem. And I understand that the whole communication on carbon right now is a problem. And I'm really hoping on the SBTI, ongoing emissions responsibility, is going to help on that because they have like, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 companies there right now, pretty big. And if there is clarity on it, I think more will come in. So hopefully, but I understand the problem. I don't have a perfect answer.
Fantastic. Um, this one is, to my mind, quite kind of technical and specific. So answer as you can.
Yep.
I'll try and reduce it. So nature-based removal projects all face reversal risk, but they manage very differently. With woodland projects under the Woodland Carbon Code using buffers and long-term management obligations, and with soil carbon schemes under emerging UK CCC standards still maturing, how should decision makers think about biochar in the UK? And they're specifically saying about how robust are current biochar standards in managing permanence and reversals, and what should buyers and public bodies look for when comparing biochar to other UK nature-based options?
So, okay, that's divided and like there's like three questions within that question. So
Mhm.
it's kind of complex. So in nature, like beyond the buffer pools, I would really check the methodology and the additionality. When you're working in nature, reversers are inevitable. As it's a risk that you have to manage. It's inevitable. Like, I don't know, like in a house, think about it as a house. Can your house burn down? Potentially. like every house can burn down. Something can happen. Lightning can hit whatever fuse and suddenly a house burns down. But what do you have? Insurance. So that's what I think about nature. Nature needs to be insured to make sure that if that happens, something happens and you're covered. That's the way I think that nature should happen, because that's the way every single thing happens in this world that's investable. It has insurance on it. If not, we wouldn't be able to have a mortgage on a house. When you go into biochar, biochar has been under scrutiny for a while. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of all of them. Like, we need all of them. If done properly, we need all of them. Um, Last I heard, like, Europe accepted the 100-year permanence, so it's technically permanent in EU 27. And there's different protocols like isometric, puro, and CAR that have different permanence criteria, and they're also based on how much of the life cycle analysis they're putting through the entire cycle of the project to include into that permanence. But and this, you go back into theory, because we'll see 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, and that's kind of the problem with all of these projects. It's like, does pyrolysis, which is burning, so how's biochar created for everybody else? It's like you have biomass and you're burning biomass in the absence of oxygen, which is called pyrolysis. And that's where you generate a stable inert carbon component that is supposed to stay locked in for at least 100 years. So all of the scientific research, not all, most of the scientific research is pushing like for it, that it's happening and it's a solution and that we should bring it in, and I'm in favor. And I hope I answered that as best as I could.
I think so. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. So I would like to thank Anew Climate for sponsoring the webinar.
No, please, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for your.
Thank you, everybody that's listening. If you want to ping me, LinkedIn or an email, whatever, I'm here. It has been a pleasure. And
Yeah, it's
thank
been
you,
well
Josh and
received.
Eddie, for hosting
We've
this.
had someone say that it was very comprehensive. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
And yeah, and thank you all in the audience for your questions and for your participation. And we will see you next time. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day, guys.
Bye.